Creating these classes requires equipment and services that cost money. If you appreciate this education, please think about going to elithecomputerguy.com and offering a one-time or monthly recurring donation. Welcome back. As you know, I am Eli the Computer Guy, and in today's class, I'm going to give you a brief introduction to frameworks in the coding world. So whenever I have new people come to me, they always ask, what is the best programming language? They always want to know what the best language is. And as I've talked about many times in the past, the best programming language is whatever programming language allows you to accomplish whatever solution that you need to accomplish. But one of the questions that rarely comes up is what framework should people be learning? So people ask about PHP, or they ask about Python or C# or Java or anything like that, and they always focus on the language itself, and curiously enough, very few people ask about frameworks. So when we're talking about frameworks, basically what we're talking about is we're talking about libraries of reusable code. So an important thing to understand in the coding world is that if you're trying to accomplish something with code, most likely somebody else has tried to do the exact same thing in the past. Not only has someone else tried to do the exact same thing in the past, probably 100,000 coders have tried to do the exact same thing in the past. And so again, one of the things you have to keep in mind, if you're going to be a professional coder, you don't want to have to keep recreating the wheel all the time. Imagine if every single person that tried to design a brand new car had to also design a brand new wheel or a brand new axle or things like that. That just wouldn't make any sense, right? If you're going to design a new Corvette or a new Ferrari or a new Ford truck, you're going to take components that people have already created and possibly customize them a little bit. You're going to take wheels and tires and axles and engines and steering wheels and seats and all that kind of thing. You're going to put some new colors on them. You're going to adjust a couple of things, and then basically, you're going to come out with either an F-150 or a Ferrari. But the reality is, if you look at a Ferrari and if you look at an F-150, there are more things similar with those two vehicles than are actually different. And the reason is because if somebody's going to be creating a vehicle, they're essentially going to be taking the exact same concept somebody else has come up with previously and added a couple of things. Again, this is very important to understand in the coding world. You don't want to have to write everything from scratch. Again, that's one thing where a lot of new people laugh at the idea of coders who copy and paste. They're like, I'm never going to copy and paste code. It's like, why not? If I can copy 100 lines of code, paste it into my project, and modify 3 lines, that seems a hell of a lot more efficient, and I'm a hell of a lot less likely to create errors than if I literally have to type out those 100 lines of code every time I'm going to build a project. The reality is real professional coders, the idea is you do a lot of copy and pasting, but the important thing with being a professional coder is that you understand what you're copy and pasting. So you copy and paste 100 lines of code, and you can read through. You basically scan through. You audit those 100 lines of code to verify it does what you think it's supposed to do. There's no weird hidden, Trojan horses or anything in there. And then you deploy it out. There's no reason to rewrite things that have already been written. Again, 100,000 times, 1,000,000 times before. Well, basically, what frameworks are is frameworks is where all of this code, this prepackaged code, has been brought together in a single package so that you can simply reference that code when you're creating your projects and when you're deploying your software into the field instead of having to rewrite everything. So almost all coding languages, any modern coding languages, are going to have frameworks. PHP has a lot of frameworks. Python has a lot of frameworks. Java has frameworks. JavaScript has frameworks. C#, I think, has frameworks. Basically, there's a lot of these frameworks out there, and the idea is that somebody sat down, they typed out specific functions, they typed out these specific libraries of code for you, so that you can add this to your project, and then all you have to do is reference what is in the libraries instead of having to rewrite the code yourself. So one of the important things to understand about frameworks is basically this is pre-written code that you're able to reference, and then the other thing thing to remember about these frameworks is that they're all pre-packaged many times to solve certain types of problems. So whenever you're going to go and work for a company, they may use one specific framework or another. So if you're going to go work for a company, again, that codes in PHP, there's Laravel is a framework. There's something called Cake PHP is a framework. They may be using a specific framework, and so it's important. Not only do you need to know the programming language, PHP, Python, whatever else, but you're also going to need to know and understand the frameworks that your company is going to be using, because that is going to be as important to you as understanding the programming language itself. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about frameworks, just giving you an overview. There are a crap ton of frameworks out there. So basically, if you want to learn frameworks for yourself, self-study, or you're a consultant or something like that, basically what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to do a bit of research and figure out what framework solves the types of problems that you care about. Just like you need to figure out what programming language solves the problems that you care about. Once you figured out that programming language, then you need to go and you need to do some research and see what frameworks will then make it faster and easier for you to code within those frameworks. If you're going to be going into the enterprise environment, or if you're going to get hired for companies, again, why it's very important to go out, go to meetups, go to tech events, grab a beer or a coffee, sit down and talk with people, and then when you're talking to them, asking them what programming languages their company uses, also ask them what frameworks they use. Because again, different areas and different companies may use different frameworks, and just like sometimes companies get locked into particular programming languages just simply because of legacy, right? This was built in PHP 10 years ago. It works. It does what people need it to do, so they're not going to spend $2 million to rewrite it into a new language. The same can be true of frameworks, right? 10 years ago, they deployed PHP as their web infrastructure. A couple years after that, they realized, oh, look, the Cake framework, Cake PHP works really well. And so they started to use Cake. And so you come in, post 2020, and you're excited to use Laravel or some new framework, and you find out like, what? You guys still use Cake? I thought that was a joke. There's actually a framework called that. But, again, it may be a legacy thing. They've been using it for so long. Again, it does exactly what the company needs done. And, one of the things you have to understand in the technology world is inertia is a very powerful force. So a lot of times coding languages, frameworks, infrastructure, all of these things are still being used, are still being supported. New products are being built off of this stuff simply because of inertia. We're building a new product using these technologies because we already have a whole infrastructure built using these technologies, and so we're just going along. So if you want to go out and figure out what framework you should learn, again, there are a lot of them out there. So if you're on your own, basically do some research, try to figure out what framework works for you. If you're going to go out and you're going to try to work for companies, again, go to meetups, talk with people, discuss it, find out what particular frameworks are popular in your area, because what you will find geographically, again, like with coding languages and other things, simply things get picked up in particular geographic areas. This geographic area, I think about that again when I talk about a few years ago when the startup movement was really big, and I was very curious. On the East Coast, PHP was really popular, and on the West Coast, Ruby on Rails was really popular. When I actually sat down and tried to talk with coders and figure out why PHP was so popular on the East Coast and Ruby was so popular on the West Coast, nobody could actually give a good answer. It was kind of, well, we're in Denver and we needed to build an infrastructure. We needed to deploy something, and everybody around here knew Ruby, so we built on Ruby. Again, on the East Coast, we needed to build something. Everybody around here knew PHP, and so we built on PHP. And then once we and all the other companies build on PHP because that's what the local knowledge base is, then in order to get a job with a company, then you need to know PHP. And it's like this weird self-reinforcing cycle. So it is important to understand, like if you're in Baltimore and you start talking to somebody in San Francisco, the languages they use, the frameworks they use, the technologies they use may be entirely different than what the people around you who are hiring actually need. So it's very important to meet people locally, not to just know the programming languages and technology, but also for things like frameworks. So now that you have a basic idea of what coding or programming frameworks are, I'd like to go over to the computer and just show you some of the different examples out there. And again, to reinforce the idea that there are so many of these different frameworks out there, so that if you are going to learn a particular type of framework, you do need to do your research to find what will be most valuable to you. So with that, let's go over to the computer. You can do a very basic Google search to find different frameworks. Again, whatever programming language that you've decided to use, Python, PHP, JavaScript, Java, C Sharp, whatever. You basically all you do is you type in, Java best frameworks. You look at the Google results, and then you get to do a couple of days of research and playing around and see what seems to work best for you. But with that, let's go over to the computer just to give you an idea of the different frameworks that are out there. So here we are again. All I did was a basic Google search. A Google search for PHP frameworks, Python frameworks, JavaScript frameworks, Java frameworks, just to give you an idea. So here is website Raygun, 10 popular PHP frameworks in 2020. So just for PHP, there are 10 frameworks. Gives you a bit of an explanation. First one is Laravel. Talks about reasons to use Laravel. Laravel is suitable when deploying applications with complex back-end requirements, whether small or large. Installing Laravel has been made easier with the introduction of Homestead. So this gives you some idea of why you might want to use Laravel as a particular framework. CodeIgniter, known for its small footprint. CodeIgniter is a PHP framework suitable for developing dynamic websites. It offers numerous pre-built modules that help with constructing robust and reusable components. So there's CodeIgniter, Symfony is one. Again, Cake PHP. This one's been around forever. Yeah, Cake PHP hit the market in the early 2000s and since then gained better performance and many new components. Cake PHP is easy to install. It makes a good choice for commercial applications due to security features that include SQL injection prevention, input validation, cross-site request forgery protection, and cross-site scripting protection. So those are some of the things to be thinking about. Zend framework is down here. Something called Falcon is down here. Fuel PHP, PHP IXE, or however you want to say it, Slim. So again, basically these are 10 frameworks just for PHP. If you go over, you can take a look at 11 Python frameworks. So the most popular framework now, didn't mean to go there. Most popular framework, at least from what I've been able to tell in the Python world, is Django. So this is a particular framework for Python. Then you got Web2Py, TurboGears, Cubic Web, Giotto, Pylon, and they got some other stuff, Bottle, Cherry Pie, Flask, so on and so forth. If you go over, JavaScript has frameworks. So if you think JavaScript is interesting, 10 best frameworks for them. They've got Angular, they've got React. So like React, created by Facebook, the React framework has earned popularity within a short period. It is used to develop and operate the dynamic user interface of the web pages with high incoming traffic. It makes the use of virtual DOM, and hence the integration of the same with any application is more straightforward. So again, this is where you sit there and you start taking a look of, again, what kind of software do you want to create? So, that Cake PHP that was talking about for back-end security, protection against SQL injection attacks, protection against cross-site scripting, that type of thing. That's what you care about. Cake PHP might be for you. Again, in the JavaScript world, creating user interfaces, maybe React is for you. Ember, Meteor, Mithril, Node.js, that's one we'll talk about a lot later. Polymer, blah, blah, blah. Again, we go over here. We also got Java frameworks, so not just for the scripting languages. We come down here, we can take a look at Spring, and there's Struts and Hibernate, and a whole bunch of different frameworks here for Java. So this just kind of gives you an idea of how many frameworks there are. So not only do you have to figure out what programming language is going to be best for your situation, but then once you've figured out that programming language, going out there and trying to figure out what framework will make it easier, faster, and better in your code, basically better, is a very important thing to be thinking about. So now you're probably sitting there going, cool, sign me up. Okay, so I get to learn a programming language, and then once I'm learning that programming language, I get to use these frameworks that will make my life a lot easier. What could possibly be the downside to this? And if you've been in the technology world for even a microsecond of time, you know that there's going to be a bit of a downside. Maybe not a huge downside, but there is some downside to using frameworks. One of the important things to understand is when you're using frameworks is that many times frameworks will have to reference services that may not be already installed on your server, right? So again, when you're thinking about like notification services, email services, all kinds of different services, in order for the framework to be able to do whatever that it's going to be able to do, it needs possibly different applications, software, services installed on your server. And if that software or services are not installed on your server, then the frameworks themselves may not function. So it's important to understand when you're dealing with frameworks, this isn't necessarily like you simply copy a folder to your root directory and then you simply, reference, different scripts or whatever within that folder. The fact of the matter is, in order to make those scripts, in order to make those functions actually work, there may have to be services and software installed on your server. And so where you get into a problem is if you're in the enterprise world, you may not have the authority to be able to install things onto your server. Again, when we start talking about what framework will you use, you may have to use a framework based off of what services are already installed on your servers in your network, right? You may have systems administrators that say, okay, this is what's installed on our infrastructure, and that's it. For us to install anything additional on our infrastructure, we're going to have to go through a 6-month, research and whatever plan in order to change anything. So basically, if you need to get something up and running tomorrow, you're going to have to use whatever we have to offer. And so again, if you're saying they're looking at Laravel or Cake or Django or something like that, you may look at what their requirements are. And basically, again, you have to understand in the technology world, if you're new in the technology world, most of our job is paint by numbers. Most of our job really is a recipe. Basically, you sit there and you go, okay, this framework looks really good. I want to use this framework. And then you look at the requirements. And then you look at your server. If the requirements and what your server has match, then you can use this framework. If they don't match and you're not able to modify your server, then you got to find another framework. That's just how it is. It doesn't matter how good that framework is. It doesn't matter how amazing that framework is. If your servers don't have the requirements for that framework, it's just not going to work. The other thing to be thinking about too is if you're going to start using frameworks is that you may run into issues where you need to understand more about computers than possibly you already know. Again, one of the big problems that I see right now in the coding world is a lot of people jump into coding with about no understanding at all of computers. Again, they don't know default gateways. They don't know how to install things onto servers. A lot of coders can barely even install a Linux operating system at this point, right? They're used to working in the platform as a service world. Basically, they're used to working in a world where they just get the platform, they upload the code, and all they have to know is the code. Well, one of the problems you run into if you start using frameworks, or you want to start using frameworks, is you may have to install additional services onto a server. You may have to understand how security and permissions work. You basically may have to have a deeper understanding of how the box or how the operating system itself works, and a lot of people can get caught up in that. Again, like I say, if you're just going out there, you're new in the technology world, so you want to learn Python, you want to learn PHP, you want to learn something like that, you're flying along. Oh, Python's easier, PHP's easier. Hey, oh, this is great. Oh, you think this framework is really going to make your life a lot easier. And so then you go to then try to use that framework and you start running into issues because you don't understand enough about how to administer the underlying system. And you got a couple of days of troubleshooting. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. To be clear, that's not necessarily a bad thing. A couple of days of troubleshooting to learn how the underlying operating system works is definitely good for you as a professional. But depending on where you are in your career, it may be a detour you don't necessarily want to do right now. Again, for me, doing technology for 20 years, I'm happy to take detours for weeks at a time to learn something I may never use again, simply because I find it to be curious. If you're literally learning your first programming language and you have to take a detour about learning Linux permissions and other things, that may get you so far off of course that it gets you confused, and again then you get frustrated and then you want to give up. So do be careful when you're thinking about frameworks. I would argue that you should have a solid understanding of the programming language that you want to use. Again, Python, PHP, JavaScript, something like that. Take a month, more or less, take a month, learn that programming language, learn how to reinvent a lot of wheels and that type of thing. And then once you feel comfortable with that, then start to take a look at the frameworks, because you'll already have a solid foundation in the coding language. So then when you go start trying to figure out the frameworks, you probably won't get so frustrated. So with that, let's go over to the computer again. I do just want to pull up Laravel for you. Again, just to kind of give you a bit of an overview to understand, again, that the installation process to actually use Laravel might be a little bit more complicated than you're expecting, because again, this is one of those things. You hear this with a lot of coders, right? Oh, a lot of these old time coders. Oh yeah, man. Oh, you're doing it the old way. All you need to do, you just need to slap this framework in there, and then in like 2 days, you're gonna be creating amazing things. And then again, you're new. You don't know the damn difference. So you download this framework, and then all of a sudden there's these requirements and these things, and then you rip your hair out, and then you want to go off and give up and be a florist. So it is important to understand that it might be a little bit more of a learning curve than you're expecting. So let's go over to the computer just so I can give you a little bit of an overview with Laravel. So this is the website for Laravel. So Laravel is a PHP framework for web artisans. Laravel is a web application framework with expressive, elegant syntax. We've already laid the foundation, freeing you to create without sweating the small things. So you can come here, again, they've got documentation, they've got videos you can watch, they have a whole bunch of stuff here. But again, once you start looking at this, you realize this is going to be a project to learn. This is not simply throw Laravel on your server and a couple of hours you're going to be knocking things out. You can see there's a lot of different stuff here that's involved with Laravel. Very powerful. Once you understand it, it will make your life a lot easier. But there is going to be a learning curve that might be a bit steeper than you're expecting. If you go over to documentation, I've already pulled this up, and you can take a look again for installation, just to understand. Here's all the things you need to do to actually install Laravel as a framework onto your server. Again, when you're dealing with a scripted programming language, so you're talking about things like JavaScript, PHP, Python, you will most likely need to be installing something onto your server in order to make that framework work. Again, if you're using, let's say, Java frameworks, compiled programming language frameworks, they will be dealt with a little bit differently. So one of the things that you have to look at is, once you figure out what framework looks interesting to you, you have to go basically take a look at what the installation instructions are. So if we take a look here, the Laravel framework has a few system requirements. All of these requirements are satisfied by the Laravel Homestead virtual machine. So they've created a virtual machine for you that has everything. So again, this is where you're gonna have to know a little bit about operating systems. You have to know what the hell a virtual machine is, a whole 9 yards. So it's highly recommended that you use Homestead as your local Laravel development environment. However, if you are not using Homestead, you will need to make sure your server meets the following requirements. And again, there are some things you have to actually be able to install here. So you have to have PHP 7.2. So that's an important thing, making sure that your server has the PHP version or whatever version that's required. The BC Math PHP extension, C-type PHP, JSON PHP extension, MB string, OpenSSL, PDO PHP extension, Tokenizer PHP extension, XML PHP extension. So if you're going to be putting Laravel on your server, you're going to be building it out on your own, you're going to have to make sure all of those things are there. Again, to be clear, not horribly complicated, but it is, it's going to take you a little bit to figure that out. Installing Laravel utilizes Composer to manage its dependencies. So before using Laravel, make sure you have Composer installed on your machine. So you have to understand what that is, be able to do that via Laravel installer. And so you go through here and you take a look. And you do everything to actually be able to install Laravel onto your particular server. And so you're just going to have to be ready for this type of thing with whatever framework you're going to use. Now, again, one of the issues that you may run into if you're dealing with things like scripted languages is you may be thinking about putting your finished code onto something like a shared hosting plan. So GoDaddy, HostGator, that type of thing. And so one thing you're going to have to think about is not only verify that shared hosting plan plan has the scripting language that you care about, PHP, Python, whatever else, but you have to make sure that your framework can be installed onto that particular shared hosting plan. I just brought up, this particular blog post. It's by Cloudways, so, take it with a grain of salt. But here's why you should stay away from Laravel shared hosting. And so this goes through, and this explains some stuff about trying to use Laravel on shared hosting and problems that you might run into. And so that's the whole thing. When we talk about things like frameworks, it's very easy to say frameworks will make your life easier. If you start using frameworks, then it will be quote unquote easier to be able to write code. Well, yes. If your server support the framework, if this, if that, if the other thing. And so again, this is where it's always a balancing act with any kind of tool you're going to use in the technology world, where again, using a framework can make some things a lot easier, but the learning curve or the requirements in order to use the framework might be a little bit difficult for you. So that's just a brief introduction to the frameworks and basically the concepts of frameworks in the coding and the programming world. Basically, this is already code that has been written. These are small systems that have been written that is then reusable so that you can build out your application much more easily, much more efficiently, much more securely. Again, a lot of new people, they always want to go out there and reinvent the wheel, but the fact of the matter is creating registrations for websites has been done literally 1.5 million times. Again, doing things like password reset systems has been done 1.5 million times. Securing sites from SQL injection attacks and cross-site scripting and all that kind of stuff. Literally, why rewrite something that has basically been done almost perfect? You always got to say almost. You always got to say almost perfectly by somebody else. Somebody else that probably spent more time focused on that one specific problem than you're gonna focus on for the entire project. They've already built all this stuff out. The other thing too is you have a community. So again, if you're using the Laravel framework or even the Cake framework or Django or something like that, you have a community of people that are using these frameworks, that are hammering the hell out of these frameworks, that are looking for problems in these frameworks. So if there are issues, it's more likely that those issues will surface and then get fixed. Again, one of the big problems, if you're writing everything from scratch, the fact of the matter is you're going to make a stupid mistake. Again, whenever you build out tech infrastructure, at some point everybody makes a stupid mistake. If you're the only person looking at that before it gets deployed into the field, the fact of the matter is the next person that's going to be looking at it is the hacker that just compromised all your systems because you did something stupid, because you were tired and you left something open when it shouldn't have been open, and now somebody is, ransomwaring your entire infrastructure. So that's an important thing with thinking about with these frameworks is for the different types of projects that you're going to be doing, for the different problems you're going to try to solve. It's a very easy way to put far more robust, far more secure applications into the field, frankly, much quicker. But you do have to remember that there is going to be a learning curve on all of these different frameworks and that there are going to be requirements. So again, Cake PHP may be 20 years old at this point. It may look old and stupid, but there may be reasons to use Cake PHP over using Laravel. There may be reasons to use particular frameworks, even though they're not as popular as other frameworks. Again, simply learning curve. Maybe you only need a couple of things, and so you don't want a big learning curve. Again, server resource requirements and that type of thing. So that's a basic overview, a bit of an introduction to what frameworks are. This is one of those things that really, at the end of the day, just figure out what programming language you want to use, then start doing some Google searches on best frameworks, start really digging in, make sure you understand what the requirements are to use the framework, understand what your infrastructure actually looks like. Again, if your infrastructure is GoDaddy shared hosting, you're going to need to use a different framework than if you are building your own server, bare metal server, and you can do whatever the hell you want. So those are some of the things that you have to be thinking about when you're looking at deploying frameworks. So with that, as always, I enjoy doing this video. I look forward to seeing you on the next one. Apparently, the type of content you just saw is not what Susan W. wants for the future of YouTube. This means that recommendations by YouTube to this channel have dropped massively and views are becoming comically small. I hate to ask. I used to say I would never ask, but if you could subscribe, like, comment, and most importantly, share the videos that you appreciate, that may help slow the death of this channel. Do remember that if anything at all happens to this channel, you can go to EliTheComputerGuy.com to view the content and access information not available on YouTube.